Hey everybody, this is chapter 3 of Peter Drucker's Max Shachtman and His Left. The chapter is titled The New International. Trotsky and Shachtman watched from Buyak with disbelief in the spring and summer of 1933 as the German Communist Party, the largest revolutionary organization in Europe, collapsed unresisting in the face of the Nazi takeover. German communist leaders crumbled in the face of the fascist attack. Rank-and-file communists accepted their leaders' disastrous policies almost without protest. By the time Shachtman left Buyak in July, Trotsky had given up hope for reforming the communist parties. Trotsky called for a new revolutionary party, first in Germany to replace the one that had been destroyed, then in every country in the world outside the Soviet Union. The Communist International was bankrupt, he said. In Shachtman's words, the Third International, once, quote, the revolutionary phoenix arising out of the ashes of the second, end quote, had become a, quote, ossified frontier patrol of the Soviet Union, end quote. A new international, a fourth international, had to be built. Quote, the tremendous historical significance of the step we are taking so boldly leaves one almost breathless upon reflection, end quote, Shachtman wrote. But he was ready for it. Back in New York in August, Shachtman began working out a strategy for building a new revolutionary organization in the United States. Shachtman dismissed the U.S. Communist Party as a, quote, seethe, end quote, which attracted new members radicalized by the Depression only to lose them because of its misguided policies. It was weighed down by a large proportion of members who depended on the leadership for their salaries. In New York, capital of the party apparatus, about 1,000 out of 3,000 communists were paid functionaries. Prospects were better for Trotskyists outside the communist ranks, he said. He exuded optimism about the prospects for a new party in the United States. Shachtman's optimism was borne out in the spring and summer of 1934, when general strikes in Toledo, San Francisco, and Minneapolis ended the quiescence of U.S. workers in the face of the Depression. By leading the Minneapolis general strike, which Shachtman helped to victory with an innovative daily strikers paper, Trotskyists gained new stature for themselves on the left. They used their new prominence to rally other radicals, particularly leftists around A.J. Must, who had led the Toledo general strike, to the idea of a new party and a new international. Shachtman predicted that the U.S. working class was headed for a, quote, speedy revolutionary development, end quote, that would put it, quote, in the front ranks of the world's working class, end quote, and that a new U.S. revolutionary party could be formed, quote, in advance of most of the other countries in the world, end quote. In December 1934, Trotsky took a step toward their goal by merging with Must's followers to form the Workers' Party of the United States. Trotsky said in 1933 that the, quote, revolutionary center of gravity, end quote, of the capitalist world, which had moved eastward toward Russia, was the revolutions of 1905 and 1917, had shifted westward. At first, Trotsky looked toward France, where Trotsky expected the next big battles between fascism and the working class to be fought. The 1934 strike wave in the United States made Trotsky look hopefully toward the United States as well. Building revolutionary parties in the United States and France became Trotsky's highest priority. Trotskyism ceased to be a movement based mainly in the Soviet Union, as it had been in the 1920s and early 1930s. For several decades after the mid-1930s, the United States and France would be its two centers. Trotskyism's turn westward released Shachtman from the dead end in which he had been trapped in the early 1930s, when Trotskyists had been waging a hopeless fight for reinstatement in the Communist Party. New vistas began to open up for him as a writer, editor, activist, and leader. Quote, this is a time for the joy of living, end quote, he said. To reach the growing ranks of new radicals, the party paper needed tools, books, pamphlets, a cheaper, more popular newspaper, a high-quality magazine. Shachtman's talents as translator, writer, and editor were in demand. The task that excited him most and demanding most of his time was the Trotskyist new magazine, The New International. One of his assistants, George Novak, remembered decades later the feeling of exhilaration, quote, as the freshly inked pages of the early issues with a two-colored cover came off the wheezy press, end quote. The New International's rejection of the, quote, bombast, exaggerations, self-praise, and tricky headlines and stories, end quote, that Shachtman saw more and more of in the Daily Worker and pressed independent leftists. Mustite philosophy professor James Burnham contributed further to its intellectual prestige when he joined Shachtman as co-editor. Orders came in from Glasgow, Rotterdam, Cape Town, Buenos Aires, Athens, Shanghai, Antwerp, and India. Writers John Dos Passos and Max Eastman praised it. A report in the late 1930s said, quote, "Everyone in Europe reads it, friend and foe alike within revolutionary circles," end quote. As editor of the foremost Trotskyist theoretical journal in English, Shachtman became the main exponent of Trotsky's ideas in the English-speaking world. Trotsky chided Shachtman jokingly, quote, "Since you have become editor of the best Marxist publication, you don't answer old friends' letters anymore," end quote. Putting out the monthly New International along with the weekly Militant, the youth newspaper, the newspapers in Yiddish, Greek, and Polish, and Trotsky's writings, quote, "took Herculean efforts," end quote. Shachtman said later, quote, "Outsiders simply could not believe that all this was being done by only a few hundred people," end quote. Throughout the 1930s, there were never more than a few hundred people to do it. The new Workers' Party was not a serious rival to the rapidly growing Communist Party, which had tens of thousands of members, let alone a serious threat to the Democrats and Republicans. After the 1934 Minneapolis strike, James Cannon suggested that Trotskyists use the old communist call for a labor party to translate their organizing success into the broader political influence they obviously still lacked. The Toledo Radicals backed the idea as they helped found the United Auto Workers in 1935-36. The call for a labor party won a short-lived majority at the Auto Workers' July 1936 convention. Shachtman helped convince the U.S. workers to reject it. But in 1938, when Trotsky convinced his U.S. followers to campaign for a labor party after all, Shachtman began a decade-long effort to find tactics and demands that would give the idea reality. Meanwhile, the political appeal of Democratic President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal helped ensure that the working-class activism of the mid-1930s did not flow into independent working-class politics. Instead, the Communist Party and many trade unionists leaving the Socialist Party swung to support the Democrats in 1936. While European Fourth Internationalists joined mass labor and social democratic parties, U.S. Fourth Internationalists reacted to their new party's isolation by dissolving it and joining the remnants of the Socialist Party, now posing as a broad left-wing alternative to both Democrats and Communists. Trotskyists inside the Socialist Party rejected the idea of building a broader labor party that might have appealed to the growing militant ranks of the CIO. Despite the radical ferment of the 1930s, Shachtman and his fellow Trotskyists found themselves swinging against the mainstream of the left. They rejected the New Deal and the Democratic Party, which most radicals embraced. They were even more starkly isolated in their criticisms of the Soviet government. In fact, mainstream leftists in this time of growth and confidence were contributing to the left's later virtual destruction in the Cold War years. The patriotism they espoused in hopes that the U.S. government would be a bulwark against fascism helped foster the uncritical Americanism that would be used against all radicals in the 1950s. The enthusiasm many of them expressed for Stalin's rule in the Soviet Union facilitated the branding of radicals as enemies of democracy. Shachtman rejected both the broader left's flirtation with patriotism and its identification with Stalinism. Shachtman was with Trotsky in Norway in 1936 when Stalin began putting most of Bolshevism's foremost leaders on trial and arresting and sometimes executing large numbers of communists. Shachtman helped Trotsky plan an international campaign against the Purge trials. In his book, Behind the Moscow Trial, and in dozens of speeches Shachtman gave as he toured the United States, Shachtman pleaded with U.S. leftists to speak out in defense of persecuted Soviet radicals. As the massacre continued, Shachtman denounced what he saw as the betrayal of the original communist vision. Shachtman began to distance himself emotionally and theoretically from the Soviet Union. The already fierce antagonism between Trotskyists and communists grew worse in response to Soviet and Western European events, particularly the Spanish Civil War. While most of the U.S. left rallied to the Republican government threatened by General Francisco Franco's fascist-backed revolt, Shachtman and other Trotskyists argued that the way to defeat Franco was to continue the radical assertion of working class power that had begun in 1936 to 37. They hoped that a socialist revolution would arise from the Civil War and give new impetus to revolutionary politics worldwide, as the Russian Revolution had in 1917. They denounced the Republican government's killing of anarchists and independent Marxists in Barcelona. They helped to bury their hopes in May and June 1937. Trotskyist intransigent criticism of socialist leaders' equivocations about the Barcelona events helped bring about their expulsion, along with hundreds of new recruits from the Socialist Party. The new Socialist Workers Party that the U.S. Trotskyists formed in early 1938, with barely 1,000 members, was the largest Trotskyist group in the world. Shachtman was second only to Trotsky as leader of their international movement. Together, the two men had prepared the first conference of the movement for the Fourth International in July 1936, which in turn prepared for the formal founding Congress of the Fourth International in September 1938. Shachtman presided over the founding Congress and wrote several major documents for it. Looking beyond the defeats of the 1930s, Shachtman foresaw the emergence of the United States as the world's hegemonic counter-revolutionary power and outlined a strategy for resisting it. Shachtman foresaw that the United States would secure its international domination through victory in the Second World War, which loomed on the political horizon as the unavoidable test for the radicals of the 1930s. The Fourth International was launched in the United States with the Trotskyist breakthrough in 1934. The breakthrough came unexpectedly with a truck driver's strike that led to a citywide general strike in Minneapolis that same year, after an auto workers' strike led by radicals in Toledo called, quote, Mustites, end quote, after their leader A.J. Must, and a longshoreman strike led by communists in San Francisco also became general strikes. Together, these three strikes captured the attention not only of radicals but of millions of working people across the country. They foreshadowed the great industrial strikes on which the CIO was founded. They also established the Trotskyists and Mustites as the communist rivals for leadership in the labor movement. The three strikes, almost simultaneous outbreaks of pent-up working-class frustration, paralleled each other closely. The Toledo strike began on the 23rd of February 1934 among auto parts workers, the San Francisco strike on the 9th of May among longshore workers, the Minneapolis strikes on the 15th of May among truck drivers. In each city, strikers succeeded in rallying the great majority of workers to their side and matched strike breakers and police force with force. Police efforts to break picket lines resulted in police shooting down dozens of unarmed strikers in each city. On the 24th of May in Toledo, the police wounded 28 strikers and killed 2. In the 5th of July, quote, Battle of Rincon Hill, end quote, in San Francisco, police wounded 109 and killed 2. On, quote, Bloody Friday, end quote, 20th of July in Minneapolis, police wounded 67 and killed 2. The bloodshed gave state governors a pretext to send in the National Guard and strike leaders the support to call citywide strikes. Only the outcomes of the three strikes differed. The Toledo radicals and Minneapolis Trotskyists fought their strikes through to victory and joined forces in their aftermath to form a new United Workers' Party. Union leaders in San Francisco were forced by craft divisions between sailors and stevedores, or stevedores, I don't know how you say that, to call for off their strike and agree to arbitration, so that another year's hard struggle was needed to win union hiring halls on the West Coast docks. Trotsky's success in Minneapolis was due to their willingness to stand together with working people against employers and the whole union hierarchy, their skill at mobilizing an entire community around the strike, and their instant recognition of the strike's importance. As it grew violent in late May, Cannon took the unusual and expensive step of traveling by plane from New York to Minneapolis, but soon returned to New York during a temporary lull. When a resumption of the strike seemed likely, every Communist League member was asked to give a full day's pay to help. Cannon set out again on the 5th of Minneapolis. Cannon set out again on the 5th of July for Minneapolis, and Shachtman was, quote, to be in readiness to follow shortly, end quote. By the time the strike broke out again on the 16th of July, half a dozen Trotskyist leaders from out of town were on the spot. Trotskyists distinguished themselves by their quickness to learn from others' experience and the creativity of their tactics. They led a strike in a city where no strike had been successful for a decade, where a third of the labor force was unemployed, where strikers' families were hungry. They overcame these difficulties by opening the union to anyone who wanted to join it, organizing an unemployed league and a women's auxiliary, and forming an alliance with the Minnesota Farmers Holiday Association. They encouraged strikers to fight back against police with baseball bats and banisters, but took on the thankless task of taking away strikers' guns even after police had shot their friends down in the street. They even set up a union hospital to avoid awkward questions from the police when wounded strikers needed medical care. Communist League leaders worked as a well-coordinated team almost throughout the strike. Shachtman played the central role in one of their most important innovations. Teamsters Local 544 had begun to publish its special strike newspaper, The Organizer, as a weekly before Shachtman arrived. But it was Shachtman who turned it into the world's first strike daily. Teamster Farrell Dobbs, who joined the Communist League only in March 1934, was listed on the masthead as its editor, but Shachtman wrote most of it and actually put it out. Quote, "A weekly paper would have been utterly inadequate to deal with the fast-moving events," end quote, Dobbs said. But, quote, "the Daily Organizer packed a wallop and the working class of the city soon came to swear by it," end quote. Cannon said, quote, "For the first time in the history of the American labor movement, strikers were not left dependent on the capitalist press, were not befuddled and terrorized by the capitalist press, ... The Daily Organizer covered the town like a blanket, ... The power of that little paper, its hold on the workers, is indescribable, ... Of all the contributions we made, the one that tipped the scale to victory was the publication of the daily paper. Without the Organizer, the strike would not have been won," end quote. The Organizer reached a circulation of 10,000 and paid its bills out of workers' voluntary donations, despite the fact that one printer after another refused to print it. It survived Shachtman and Cannon's 5th of July arrest on criminal syndicalism charges. Cannon later blamed their arrest on Shachtman's decision to wear a 10-gallon cowboy hat around Minneapolis. Shachtman may have thought that this headgear was common west of Chicago, but it might have helped the police pick the Trotskyists out of a crowd. Dragged to a police station at 10 o'clock at night, fingerprinted, denied the right to a lawyer to know the charges against them, the two leaders were released by a judge 2 days later. Warrantless searches of their hotel rooms have produced no damning evidence against them, only to be put under immediate military arrest. A sergeant with a submachine gun and a dozen guardsmen with automatics and rifles took them in a truck to a National Guard armory, where their guards were told, quote, "shoot to kill if they make a move to escape," end quote. Shachtman and Cannon may have had a few nervous hours in the armory as they remembered Rosa Luxemburg's and Karl Liebknecht's fate. After 6 hours, they were released and told to leave the city, and appealed to the state's farmer labor governor. The man who had declared martial law against the strikers got the illegal expulsion order revoked the next morning. But soon Shachtman had to go back to New York anyway. The New International's second issue was already running behind schedule. Another Trotskyist took over his job at the Organizer. Shachtman was not in Minneapolis on the 22nd of August to see the strikers' victory. Before the Minneapolis strike, the Trotskyists were widely seen, despite or because of their high-quality publications and their campaign against German fascism, more as intellectuals than as activists. They attracted mainly students, quote, "intellectual is good and bad, very few workers, even fewer active trade unionists," end quote, Shachtman remembered. Minneapolis changed the group's profile. Its authority was, quote, "immensely enhanced," end quote. With the momentum of the Minneapolis victory behind them, Trotskyists took their first big step toward forming a new U.S. Revolutionary Party. As in 1928, Shachtman was eager to escape from a narrow, faction-ridden existence to a new organization based on principles. Shachtman suggested that the Communist League unite with Musk's American Workers' Party. a pacifist preacher turned socialist leader, had begun by organizing Massachusetts textile workers in 1919, set up a labor college called Brookwood in 1921, and then formed a new socialist group around it. This loose group of radicals, many of them refugees from the Communist Party, had been talking since 1931 about building a new party in the United States that was then more revolutionary than the socialists and less sectarian than the in the United States that was more revolutionary than the socialists and less sectarian than the communists. Trotskyist leadership in Minneapolis made Mustites view them with respect, and Mustites won Trotskyist respect by leading the Toledo strike. After several months of negotiations, Mustites accepted Trotskyist conception of the Fourth International. In December 1934, the two groups merged into the new Workers' Party. In the process of moving toward a new party, Shachtman restored his working relationship with Jim Cannon, but strained and broke off his friendships with Marty Abern, Al Glotzer, and Maurice Spector. From 1931 to 33, Shachtman had led them against Cannon because he thought that Cannon was holding back the Communist League, for example, by opposing the weekly Militant. Now, as Cannon had a new surge of energy and threw himself into the Trotskyist new endeavors as enthusiastically as Shachtman, Shachtman became Cannon's ally. Abern, Glotzer, and Spector felt that he had deserted them. Abern resisted merger with the Mustites. Glotzer, who went back to Chicago with Edith Harvey in the summer of 1933 because he could not find a job in New York, felt ill-informed, neglected, and personally slighted by Shachtman, whom he thought of as a close friend. Quote, "You were disappointing to me and to all the other comrades with whom you were associated in the past," end quote, he told Shachtman. Shachtman felt that if his critics were to prevail, the Fourth International would never get, quote, off paper and into life, end quote, in the United States. Shachtman lost patience in particular with Abern, who had developed a habit of writing letters to his particular friends in the organization, giving his own slant on issues and events. At the end of 1934, to his old friend's shock and surprise, Shachtman joined Cannon in attacking them, singling out Martin Abern for forming a, quote, clique, end quote, with a, quote, destructive, negative, and spiteful position, end quote. Although Shachtman lost old friends by uniting with the Mustites, he found new allies among them. James Burnham, a Mustite professor of philosophy at New York University, now became Shachtman's fellow editor of the New International. Shachtman was impressed but ill at ease with his new colleague. He had never met anyone like Burnham, a tall, conservatively dressed graduate of Princeton and Oxford, whose father was a British-born railroad executive. Burnham was logical, polite, reserved, dry. Burnham rarely argued or gossiped. Al Glotzer remembered Burnham as a, quote, cold fish, end quote. Burnham insisted on keeping his job at New York University while going back and forth to his editing job. He resisted all his comrades' urgings that he come work in the party office. Everyone, quote, felt that although he was with us, and with us thoroughly, he was not, so to say, of us, end quote, Shachtman remembered. Another Mustite Shachtman would later work closely with was Ernest McKinney, the only African-American among the new party's leaders. McKinney grew up in West Virginia, where his grandfather fought to organize miners and his father was principal of a black school. McKinney joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Socialist Party before the First World War. McKinney came back from the war a communist, worked with African-American socialist A. Philip Randolph to organize Pullman car porters, then became a national leader of the Mustite organized unemployed movement. In the new party, McKinney was looking to us as an authority. In the new party, McKinney was looked to as an authority on unemployment, labor, and African-American issues. Trotskyists emerged from the Minneapolis strike and unification with the Mustites with a glowing Trotskyists emerged from the Minneapolis strike and unification with the Mustites with a glowing sense that the future would be theirs. The New International voiced their sense of the limitless possibilities ahead. Quote, Once started on the road of radicalization, the American workers will move with 7 legal boots, end quote, it predicted. They would, quote, accomplish miracles of progress that would bring the United States well towards the top in the list of revolutionary succession, end quote. But events soon dimmed their optimism. Despite the excitement of Minneapolis and Toledo, Trotskyists and Mustites were unable to channel their strike victories into a serious national political impact. Trotsky had suggested in 1933 that, quote, 2,000 or 3,000 members, end quote, would suffice to get a new revolutionary party going. The Workers' Party fell short of this modest goal. Even the Communist Party was 50 or 100 times its size. By August 1935, Shachtman admitted that it was, quote, only the beginnings of a party, end quote. Creating a mass revolutionary party in the United States would require even more flexibility and a greater variety of tactics than creating new communist parties after the Russian Revolution had, he said. Creating a mass revolutionary party in the United States would require even more flexibility and a greater variety of tactics than creating new communist parties after the Russian Revolution had, Shachtman said. After all, one victory in Minneapolis hardly outweighed the defeats Trotskyists had suffered in the Soviet Union and Germany. Quote, we have only our ideas, practically no organization, no state power, parenthesis, just the contrary, end parenthesis, end quote. Shachtman said, quote, if we do not break out of our sectarian existence, we are doomed, end quote. The Communist Party of the mid-1920s, trapped in a sectarian ghetto itself, had come up with a tactic to help it break out, campaigning for a labor party. The Minneapolis and Toledo victories would have made a broad labor party a more plausible medium-term goal for the Workers' Party in the mid-1930s than it had ever been for communists in the 1920s. Some of the Workers' Party experienced unionists floated the idea. After the Minneapolis strike, Cannon cautiously suggested that a labor party based on reinvigorated unions was, quote, not out of the question, end quote. But Shachtman opposed Cannon. Shachtman helped formulate a Workers' Party policy that allowed the branches to support Labor Party campaigns only in exceptional circumstances. The idea of Marxists organizing, quote, another party for the, quote, second-class citizens, end quote, for the, quote, backward workers, end quote, had been, quote, shelved with a sigh of relief, end quote, years before, Shachtman said. But the rise of the CIO made the movement for a labor party impossible for Shachtman to dismiss. Encouraged by the 1933 National Recovery Act, 1 million people joined unions in 1932-36, an unprecedented influx that split apart the narrow craft-dominated American Federation of Labor. Several dissident AFL leaders formed the Committee for Industrial Organization to take control of new organizing drives. Meanwhile, the Toledo Mustites, who had led the 1934 Autolite strike, went on to organize the General Motors Chevrolet plant there in April 1935. Their early leadership in Toledo enabled them to play a significant role in founding the United Auto Workers and forced them to deal with auto activists' eagerness to translate newfound economic strength into political power. Roosevelt's New Deal had not reversed the fall in workers' living standards, which had been cut in half between 1929 and 1932. Because capitalists were investing in new machinery, only part of the increase in output in 1935-36 created new jobs. Though there were now unemployment benefits, they were low, financed by workers' contributions from their wages and administered without any say from the workers' own organizations. Strikes were still being, quote, broken in a subtle fashion by government mediation boards or brutally by private gangsters, police, or National Guard without effective rebuke from the, quote, liberal, end quote, administration, end quote. Trotskyists noted, despite the spread of strikes, increasingly aggressive strike tactics, and the increased public willingness to fight alongside workers against strike breakers and police, organizing drives have been beaten back. Though the 1937 Flint and Pontiac sit-downs would win union recognition from General Motors, most industries remained unorganized. Many auto workers were ready to support a party that, unlike the Democrats, would unequivocally back their organizing efforts. At the July 1936 convention of the United Auto Workers, the Toledo Radicals led a delegation commanding 17% of the votes that was seated over the opposition of CIO leaders. Despite the old Workers' Party position to the contrary, Toledo delegates joined Socialists and Communists in a unanimous convention vote calling for a national farmer-labor party. Then they fought successfully when the vote was first taken, unsuccessfully when the leadership forced a second vote against CIO leadership pressure for an endorsement of Franklin Roosevelt's re-election campaign. Around the country, CIO leaders were forced to camouflage support for Democrats as a temporary exception to their commitment to labor's political independence. They called the political action group they founded in April 1936 Labor's Nonpartisan League and its New York affiliate, formed to divert socialist and communist votes to Roosevelt, the American Labor Party. Trotskyist flexibility in the United Auto Workers at first made no dent in their official position. Neither did the flexibility of Minneapolis Teamster Trotskyists in the spring of 1937 in supporting Minneapolis farmer labor mayor against a communist-backed challenge. But in 1938, discussions in Mexico City with Shachtman, Cannon, and other leaders of the new party, Trotsky convinced them that the CIO's rise had made Trotskyist opposition to a labor party obsolete. The creation of a labor party based on the CIO in the midst of the Depression and an escalating strike wave would mean, quote, a terrible sharpening of forces, end quote, he said. A revolutionary group that did not jump into it would, quote, doom itself to isolation. End quote. Trotsky warned that trade union officials would try to tame the Labor Party movement. Radicals should not take any responsibility for a Labor Party while such leaders controlled that Labor Party. Instead, radicals would have to challenge the leaders with their own program of, quote, transitional demands, end quote, designed to push the movement beyond the limits union officials set for it. Quote, the further sharpening of the revolutionary situation, end quote, Trotsky said, quote, will inevitably break the shell of the Labor Party, end quote. To push Trotskyists forward in this tricky situation, he drew up a program of transitional demands, which he called the death agony of capitalism and the tasks of the Fourth International, featured on this channel. This document was nicknamed, quote, the Transitional Program, end quote. Under the name, it became the Trotskyist single most important document. Once Shachtman had digested Trotsky's reasoning, he became one of the main interpreters of the new Labor Party policy. Shachtman stressed the need to adapt Trotsky's document to the United States and sort out the demands in it that the party could act on right away, the ones it should raise in broader movements, and the ones it could use only as propaganda. Shachtman urged support for union affiliation to Labor's Nonpartisan League, the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party, and the American Labor Party, and advocated work inside these groups for a real Labor Party instead of a new, quote, bourgeois liberal party, end quote. Shachtman borrowed many of Trotsky's statements word for word on how transitional demands could bridge the gap between the objective possibility of overthrowing capitalism and workers' unreadiness to do it, but he added his own cautious emphasis on the need, quote, to advance or on occasion, to retreat, altering the emphasis and utilization of slogans and shifting tactics through which the program is presented, end quote. By the logic of the Trotskyist new strategy, Ken had been right to suggest more openness to independent electoral campaigns in 1934. Shachtman's hostility to the idea might have made Trotskyists miss opportunities to give the 1934 and 1937 strikes independent political expression. Their belated change in orientation was made at least temporarily fruitless by the slowing of working-class radicalization. After a rhetorical leftward swing that helped Roosevelt win re-election in 1936, the administration turned to conservative economic policies that sent the country back into the depths of the Depression by late 1937. The monthly average of strikes declined from 395 in 1937 to 231 in 1938 to 192 in 1939. At the same time, the AFL broke the momentum of CIO organizing by launching a virtual civil war in labor's ranks, signing sweetheart agreements with employers that the CIO had laid siege to, and walking out of the local quasi-labor parties. Shachtman's failure in the mid-1930s to find a way forward to a new mass party left Shachtman reacting against more powerful political actors. Franklin Roosevelt captured most working people's imagination and thirst for change with his, quote, Second New Deal, end quote, of 1935 to 36. At the same moment, the Communist Party's, quote, Popular Front strategy had led the Communist Party to support Roosevelt. The Communists, not the Trotskyists, became the major radical force of the 1930s and 1940s. In later years, the idea of a Labor Party would be central to Shachtman's effort to put his kind of socialism on the U.S. political agenda. Meanwhile, Shachtman was left to articulate a hypothetical alternative to the New Deal and Popular Front. From the late 1920s on, Democrats like Alfred Smith had turned the Democratic Party toward an urban base and a reform program. Both Smith and Franklin Roosevelt pioneered some reforms as Democratic governors of New York. After the 1934 strikes, Roosevelt's commitment to reform deepened. Movements born of the strikes were fueling the growth of socialist groups as well as a broader farmer labor movement. Shachtman had reason to fear that a major opponent in the Roosevelt had reason to fear that a major opponent in the 1936 election might come from the left. He responded with a major policy shift. Roosevelt's, quote, First New Deal, end quote, of 1933 had little appeal for the left. The First New Deal aimed mostly to help business by relaxing antitrust laws, bailing out banks, and keeping up prices. The, quote, Second New Deal, end quote, of 1935 was a stronger bid for labor support. The Second New Deal's highlights were the Wagner Act, which authorized and regulated union organizing, and the Social Security Act, which created the first national system of old age pensions and unemployment benefits. Roosevelt also pumped up the economy with public spending so that unemployment eased a little. Roosevelt's reforms posed a challenge to the left that it might have been able to meet by uniting into an independent party with its own more radical program. But at this critical juncture, the growing Communist Party chose to cement rather than weaken working people's dependence on Democrats. Stalin had been shocked to find that as Hitler headed toward confrontation with Britain and France after 1933, he simultaneously broke off the decade-old German-Soviet rapprochement. Looking frantically for allies in a possible German-Soviet war, Stalin sent communists in a new direction in 1935 with the policy of the Popular Front. The Communist International told communists to ally with socialists and to support liberals who would oppose fascism, favor reforms, and push for a pro-Soviet foreign policy. Communists took the fight for socialism in the United States, and then even the fight for a Labor Party, off their immediate agenda. U.S. communists tacitly supported Roosevelt's 1936 re-election campaign. U.S. communists began supporting U.S., British, and French military budgets on the grounds that these governments were, quote, peace-loving, end quote. U.S. communists, quote, discovered an affinity for the spirit of '76, for George Washington, for the American flag and the national anthem, end quote, Shachtman said. For Trotskyists, the Popular Front confirmed the prediction that building, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, would mean hobbling the communist movement as a revolutionary force. In Shachtman's eyes, communists were putting themselves through, quote, contortions, end quote, to prove that they were, quote, housebroken, end quote. But while Stalin's foreign policy provided the initial impetus for the Popular Front, communists benefited by association from the enthusiasm working people and radicals felt for the New Deal. Many socialists believed that Roosevelt, though no socialist, was bringing socialism closer in the United States. Many of them joined the Communist Party. The belief took hold on the left that reform, not revolution, was the road to U.S. socialism. Shachtman responded by showing how state intervention in the economy reinforced rather than undermined capitalism. Shachtman gave an analysis of the class dynamics behind the New Deal, articulated most fully later in the 1940s, that would have done credit to an academic Marxist of the 1980s or 1990s with a clarity that few latter-day academic Marxists could match. He exemplified his conviction that the Marxism he had learned from Lenin and Trotsky could be easily and thoroughly, quote, Americanized, end quote. In Shachtman's words, since the capitalist state, In Shachtman's words, since the capitalist state works, quote, to maintain the conditions of capitalist production, end quote, the capitalist state also has to, quote, regulate the conflict within the capitalist class, which is united, as a rule, end quote, only against the working class. The New Deal preserved capitalism from collapse and the capitalist class from fragmentation by countering the short-sightedness of individual capitalists and winning over most of the working class. Quote, for every scratch they suffered under bracket Roosevelt's and bracket administration, end quote, Shachtman concluded, quote, he saved them a bone that would otherwise have been broken, end quote. Many communists and social democrats in the 1930s felt that even if the New Deal did save capitalism, it was a far preferable alternative to fascism. Many communists reasoned that the alliance of pro-New Deal capitalists with most of the left represented the overall best interest of U.S. society. Shachtman responded, quote, there is no such thing as, quote, society as a whole, end quote, and there has not been for hundreds and thousands of years, end quote. The New Deal was no more an instrument of, quote, society as a whole, end quote, than Nazism, which together led to the Second World War. The fact that Nazism required a harsh dictatorship, while the New Deal did not only show that U.S. capitalism was richer and more powerful than German. As Hitler said, quote, democracy is a luxury of rich nations, end quote. The New Deal was the luxury of rich U.S. capitalism. Quote, did the operation bring Roosevelt and the New Deal state into conflict with certain sections of the capitalist class? Of course, exclamation point. ... Did Roosevelt and the New Deal force certain sections of the capitalist class to seek support in the ranks of the working class? Yes. To be sure, the bourgeois class can come into conflict. The bourgeois state can come into conflict with the bourgeoisie, and ... the working class can extract economic and political concessions from the bourgeois state, especially from the bourgeois democratic state. It is an important discovery. At any rate, it was important when it was first made a century or two ago, end quote. The reason that most leftists saw such reforms as being in the interests of, quote, society as a whole, end quote, Shachtman said, was that they had fallen victim to the ruling confusion of every unjust society, the confusion of the ruler's interest with the people's. Once the overthrow of the existing order seems an unreal prospect, then patching it up in such a way that people can somehow survive under it inevitably seems to be in their interest, though it is far more in their ruler's interest than in theirs. Similarly, communist defense of U.S. democracy only convinced Shachtman how thoroughly communists had forgotten the original communist vision of a more thoroughgoing working-class democracy. Communists no longer saw clearly how U.S. democracy really functions, how U.S. democracy keeps third parties off the ballot, limits freedom of the press to those that own one, denies the vote to immigrants, migrant workers, and the majority of the world's population over whom the United States, quote, rules by sheer force, end quote. Quote, all the bourgeois democracies, quote, of all the bourgeois democracies, the American is the most reactionary and the least responsive to the will of the masses. No other bourgeois democracy has a political system so cunningly calculated to thwart the will of the people, with its states' rights, its division into a bicameral legislative body, its enormously bureaucratized executive with unprecedented powers, its appointed judiciary and lawmaking and law-breaking powers, its outrageously undemocratic system for amending the Constitution, its broken field system of electing congressmen every 2 years, presidents every 4 and senators every 6, with its boss patronage political machine which parallels and mocks the legal government machinery from top to bottom, to mention only a few of the traditional and fundamental characteristics of our bourgeois democracy, end quote. Even when communists were only proposing joint action with socialists, Shachtman warned that they were putting too much emphasis on deals in Congress and unions and not enough on action in the streets. When communists moved to ally with liberal Democrats, he rejected this kind of unity altogether. Communists had only traded in the disastrous policy they had followed in Germany until 1933 for the disastrous policy of the Social Democrats for the disastrous policy the Social Democrats had followed in Germany until 1933. He said, just as social democratic appeals to liberals had weakened, not strengthened resistance to fascism, so would communist appeals to liberals now. Social democratic appeals to liberals, Shachtman said, had reflected, quote, a deeply felt desire to protect the mighty organizations and institutions of labor, ... The Stalinists have adopted the same line out of just as deep a desire to protect the proletarian institutions and the foundations of socialism, which are being laid in the Soviet Union, ... Such a line must ultimately lead, as it already has in Germany, to the wiping out of these institutions and conquests, end quote. Where am I? The only way to preserve democratic rights even under capitalism was to mobilize those who could be counted on, working people, and only radical ideas would mobilize them. But Shachtman's logic was powerless against the tangible benefits and potent rhetoric of the New Deal. The Popular Front policy of supporting it attracted many people to communism. Though the proportion of workers in the Communist Party fell in the later 1930s, it recruited widely among students and progressive-minded middle-class people. Shachtman later estimates that 95% of the people who became radicals in the 1930s were under communist leadership or influence. Support for the New Deal and Popular Front extended into the Socialist Party's ranks. More diverse than the communists and lacking the unity imposed from above on the communists, the Socialist Party grew more slowly and was weakened by internal battles. The Socialist, quote, old guard, end quote, rooted in New York's largely Jewish garment unions, was fiercely anti-communist and increasingly drawn toward Roosevelt. Younger socialists were attracted to the more radical-sounding, quote, militant, end quote, group, whose radicalism was tempered by the desire for unity on the left. Ironically, after their own disastrous mistakes had helped bring fascism to power in Germany, communists could successfully appeal to other socialists to unite against the fascist danger. With the communists' turn away from revolutionary politics, the old barriers between the communists and socialists seemed less important. Shachtman and Cannon worried that the growth of the socialist left wing could be, quote, swallowed up and consequently vitiated and destroyed, end quote, by the communists. The result would be a left turned into almost unanimous cheerleaders for the Democratic Party, wasting all the potential for independent politics created by the Depression. Shachtman and Cannon had hardly established themselves in their new Workers' Party before they began to wonder how something might be saved from the Socialist Party. Tensions built up in 1934 and 1935 between the Socialist Party's leadership, controlled by the, quote, militants, end quote, and the increasingly pro-Roosevelt, quote, old guard. In early 1936, the old guard walked out of the Socialist Party. Soon, the old guard, joined by the communists, would create the pro-Roosevelt American Labor Party the pro-Roosevelt American Labor Party in New York State. Shachtman would later help convince Trotskyists to work in the ALP to try to turn it into a truly independent party. But in 1936-37, Trotskyists refused to have anything to do with it. Instead, in May 1936, the Workers' Party dissolved itself so that its members could join the Socialist Party and build with the remaining socialists an alternative to both the old guard and the communists. Al Goldman, a Trotskyist lawyer from Chicago, had joined the Socialist Party in 1934 and started a newspaper for its far left wing, the Socialist Appeal. Now he welcomed his old comrades into the Socialist Party. The Appeal became the new Trotskyist paper, and Trotskyists called themselves the, quote, Appeal Group, end quote. Armed only with the Appeal and their political skills, they won new recruits among socialists. Growth and merger with the Mustites had increased their numbers from about 200 in early 1933 to 400 to 500 in early 1936. By winning over the left wing of the Socialist Party, they doubled their ranks again, and Shachtman enlarged his circle of admiring younger followers. Young Trotskyists like Nathan Gould and Manny Geltman joined the Young People's Socialist League, the socialist youth group, and won over its major leaders. Al Goldman had already won over Ernest Erber, a soft-spoken, even-tempered, blonde Midwesterner who had become YPSL's national chairman. Hal Draper was perhaps the most prominent new supporter, a 22-year-old high school teacher from Brooklyn and left-wing leader in New York who had begun to accumulate an impressive Marxist erudition. Another YPSL left-winger, Herman Benson, who was working as a laborer after being expelled from City College for taking part in a demonstration, remembered Draper as, quote, a stickler for formulations and principles, ... socially sort of awkward, a guy of absolute integrity, end quote. Before the Trotskyists joined the Socialists, Draper became friends with Joe Carter. Draper also knew Geltman from Brooklyn College. Soon the appeal group made Draper YPSL National Secretary. By mid-1937, the appeal group had won over the overwhelming majority of the Young People's Socialist League, many hundreds of new supporters of the Fourth International, in addition to the hundreds of adult socialists newly convinced of Fourth Internationalist politics. The Young Socialists would be Shachtman's most loyal constituency. One of them, Julius Jacobson, remembered, quote, when Max spoke at a, quote, big meeting, end quote, at Irving Plaza or Webster Hall, we were always there. It was not merely that we were entertained by his razor-sharp wit, his polemical skills, his sense of irony, his robust humor, but primarily because we were clearly in the presence of an exceptional political intelligence, end quote. Jacobson and his crowd respected Cannon, but, quote, knew him as Cannon. Shachtman was Max. We could joke and banter with Max, end quote. Jacobson remembered Shachtman as, quote, a young man's person, ... He was fun to be with, end quote. Shachtman's followers had, quote, special feelings, end quote, for Shachtman. Shachtman's followers were, quote, Shachtmanites in a political and personal sense, end quote. Quote, Max's boys, end quote. In the late 1930s, some of Max's boys would take midnight hikes across the Bronx together, drawn into a kind of, quote, male bonding, a retreat from the pressures of politics and sex, end quote. Today, in a world grown conscious of homoerotic undertones, the intense bond between Shachtman and his young male followers might not have the same feel of simplicity and innocence it had for them. Meanwhile, Shachtman's relationships with older Trotskyist leaders grew more complex. Shachtman's already cool relations with Al Glotzer became more distant in some ways in the late 1930s. Glotzer's relationship with Edith Harvey had been difficult. Harvey still, quote, carried a torch, end quote, for her husband John Harvey, whom she had married in her teens and never divorced. In the spring of 1934, Edith Harvey left Glotzer and moved back to New York. The move brought her closer to Shachtman, who, quote, always had a soft spot, end quote, for her. In 1937, Shachtman left Billy Ramloff and moved to the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. Harvey lived with Shachtman there. With Shachtman and Harvey sharing an apartment, Harvey, quote, couldn't tolerate being there, end quote. Glotzer remembered. He visited their home once in 10 years. Harvey rarely welcomed any of Shachtman's Trotskyist friends into their house. She had no, quote, real vital interest, end quote, in politics. Whether because of Harvey's feelings, Shachtman's own desire for privacy, or both, his life at home became a realm apart from his political associates that his political associates rarely glimpsed. Although quite a few Trotskyists lived in the South Bronx, which is still, quote, sort of fresh open country, end quote, in the 1930s, they rarely knew what Shachtman did, quote, outside working hours, end quote. Shachtman had hardly any social ties with Cannon, who lived in Greenwich Village, a neighborhood with a working class as well as bohemian character in those years. Shachtman did not regain the personal closeness he had had with Cannon in the 1920s, or with Glotzer in the early 1930s. Whatever the state of their personal relationships, Trotskyist leaders were pleased at the headway they had made among socialists. But the same issues that had led them to join the Socialist Party, Stalin's policies, the Popular Front in Europe, the New Deal at home, would make their time inside it stormy and short. By the mid-1930s, Trotskyists saw the fate of socialism as dependent on the battle they were waging with Stalinists for leadership of the left. The Trotskyists were by far the weaker force. Their weakness was most obvious in the Soviet Union, where they were almost all in concentration camps. Although U.S. and Western European Trotskyists were now more focused on prospects for socialism in their own countries, their attention was continually pulled back to the fate of the original Soviet Trotskyists and the First Workers' Revolution. They were helpless to hinder Stalin's reshaping of Soviet society, which was taking forms they had never expected. Stalin was bearing the egalitarian principles of the Bolshevik Revolution. Stalin increased wage disparities, eliminated days off, set up special stores for officials, reestablished ranks and titles in the army, and gave managers absolute power in the factories. Stalin banned abortion and recriminalized homosexuality. Stalin enforced these iniquities with savage repression. Quote, a 12-year-old who commits a theft is now punishable by death in Stalin's, quote, socialist, end quote, society, end quote. Shachtman said, quote, no country on the face of the earth has such a barbarous piece of legislation on its books, end quote. Worse than the new penal legislation were the purges of the late 1930s, which killed off Stalin's communist critics and completed the accumulation of power in the bureaucracy's hands. The new privileges and repression amounted in Trotskyists' minds to a bureaucratic counter-revolution. By 1936, Trotsky gave up any hope of putting the Soviet Union back on course with a genuine socialist order without violent upheavals. Trotsky expected a civil war against Stalinism in the Soviet Union and a prolonged fight against official communism almost everywhere in the world. For Shachtman, the battle with Stalinism became a continual preoccupation. For although Shachtman's internationalist commitment remained as strong as ever, Shachtman began to shed the identification with the Soviet Union that had been central to his internationalism in the 1920s. By the end of 1936, Shachtman saw Stalinism as the main obstacle to socialism within the labor movement. Quote, Stalinism does not represent our conception of socialism. Stalinism oppresses men instead of liberating men. Stalinism debases and humiliates and demoralizes men instead of raising men to the lofty level of a new dignity and freedom and independence. ... The struggle against Stalinism is ... the struggle for the honor of the movement and for its future, end quote. With the dramatic growth the Communist Party was enjoying in the late 1930s, Shachtman and Shachtman's comrades had a fight on their hands. The more Shachtman focused on the fight against Stalin's regime, the more important it was for Shachtman to understand it. At first, Shachtman worked together with Trotsky to explain the Soviet counter-revolution without giving up his loyalty to the Soviet state. Shachtman insisted that the Russian Revolution was still, quote, filled with life, potentialities, resources that merely need touching off to reassert themselves, end quote. But for Shachtman, this optimistic analysis of Soviet society was only a first attempt at a new understanding. The purges shook his optimism. Trotsky's willingness to modify the analysis in subtle ways in order to deal with new issues, such as the need to organize new revolutionary Soviets and the need to support Ukrainian resistance to Russian rule, increased Shachtman's willingness to reconsider. Other Trotskyists were challenging Trotsky's analysis openly by the end of 1937. Shachtman's adherence to it would not outlast the 1930s. The position Trotsky took in 1936 was already a qualification of his old explanation of Stalinism as a short-lived regime wavering between capitalism and the working class. Stalin's success in crushing all his enemies put in question Trotsky's belief that once, quote, the proletariat springs into action, end quote, the Soviet bureaucracy could be pushed aside by, quote, measures of a police character, end quote. In October 1933, Trotsky admitted that real communists could no longer hope to recapture the Soviet Communist Party. The July 1936 Trotskyist World Conference finally said that since state coercion in the USSR had become, quote, concentrated, open, and cynical, end quote, the opposition had, quote, been robbed of the last possibility of a legal reformation, end quote. A violent revolution would be necessary. But Trotskyists still valued the nationalization of industry, economic planning, and independence from the world capitalist market brought about by the Russian Revolution. They still wanted to defend the Soviet Union in a war with any capitalist state so that these gains of the revolution would not be lost. In order to preserve these principles, Trotsky developed a position that called for both overthrowing Stalin's regime and defending the Soviet state. The key idea in this argument was that although Soviet society was not socialist and the state had, quote, degenerated, end quote, it was still a, quote, workers' state, end quote, and the revolution Trotskyists wanted in the USSR was a, quote, political revolution, end quote, not a, quote, social revolution, end quote. Trotskyists explained this stand with an analogy between the Soviet Union and a gangster-controlled labor union. Socialists should never support employers even against a gangster-controlled union, they said, but neither should they stop trying to get rid of the gangsters who are robbing and weakening the union. Similarly, Marxists should simultaneously defend the workers' state against its external capitalist enemies and the internal enemies ruling it and speaking in its name. Quote, when the union is engaged in direct struggle with the capitalist enemy, end quote, Shachtman said, quote, the truest defenders of the workers' interests will be those who combat, inside the union, those reactionary or corrupt leaders whose continued domination of the union is just the thing that paralyzes it, end quote. Shachtman said that the Soviet bureaucracy still defended working class interests, quote, distortedly and decreasingly, end quote. Though he suggested that it might become, quote, so corrupted that it cannot or does not fight for its class, even though the latter's defeat means the wiping out of the bureaucracy itself, end quote. Trotsky's insistence that the Soviet Union was still a workers' state was undermined by events only weeks after the 1936 Trotskyist World Conference endorsed his position. Shachtman was with Trotsky in Norway when news reached them of a new trial in Moscow on the murder of S.M. Kirov, a communist Politburo member who had been killed in Leningrad in December 1934. There had already been a secret trial for the killing, in which at least 100 of Stalin's opponents were charged with complicity in a, quote, white terrorist, end quote, plot. 114 had been executed. Quote, a plot has indeed been hatched, end quote, Shachtman had said, a plot by Stalin, quote, to dispose of revolutionists under the guise of combating counter-revolutionists, end quote. Now Stalin staged another public trial. On the 15th of August 1936, the Soviet state prosecutor announced the indictment of 16 Soviet leaders for Kirov's murder, as well as plots to murder Stalin and other high officials. Trotsky's name figured prominently in the indictment. The trial opened on the 19th of August. It consisted mostly of the defendants' confessions. On the 24th of August, it was over. All the defendants were sentenced to be shot. On the 25th of August, the Soviet press announced, quote, the verdict has been carried out, end quote. This trial was only the beginning of an assault by Stalin on the ranks of the Communist Party. Stalin began with Trotskyists and ex-Trotskyists, moved on to anyone who had ever opposed him, and finished with most of the leaders who had supported him through all the faction fights. In the end, Stalin killed the great majority of the members of Lenin's Central Committee, the great majority of those who had been delegates to his triumphal party Congress in 1934, and a million or more rank-and-file communists. By the time the purges ended, most of the Bolsheviks who had created the Soviet state had been eliminated from its ranks. The underlying continuity Trotsky had seen between the state of 1917 and the state of 1936 was shattered. In his book, Behind the Moscow Trial, finished in November 1936, Shachtman stressed the discontinuity in Soviet society that the purges symbolized and completed. Stalin was killing, quote, the whole Leninist guard, the men who directed the Russian movement, who directed its destinies through the Civil War, end quote, Shachtman said. Stalin had, quote, dug the grave of the Third International, its founders, its traditions, and literally filled it with corpses, end quote. The Moscow defendants symbolized, quote, a different epoch, a different tradition, a different ideology than that of the new ruling caste, which could not and would not assimilate the old into the new, end quote. Stalin was using the trials to discredit the Bolshevik tradition by depicting longtime Bolshevik leaders as terrorists and fascists. Shachtman responded by telling the defendants' political history and explaining their communist principles. He told the story of the debate on terrorism carried on for 4 decades in Russia, in which the defendants had unanimously argued against it. Shachtman responded by telling the defendants' political history and explaining their communist principles. Shachtman told the story of the debate on terrorism carried on for 4 decades in Russia, in which the defendants had unanimously argued against it. Shachtman told the story of Trotsky's fight to unite the left against Hitler in 1931-33. Without denying the possibility of fascist infiltration in Trotskyist ranks, Shachtman pointed out that there were known and admitted cases of Gestapo agents in communist parties and none in Trotskyist groups. It was Stalin who was imitating Hitler's 1934 blood purge, not Trotsky. It was Stalin's victory that fascist newspapers hailed as, quote, a victory of political reason over revolutionary romanticism, end quote. Why then had the Moscow defendants confessed? Shachtman pointed out that none of the defendants was still a Trotskyist. Each had renounced his opposition to Stalin more than once, some 5 times. They still believed that they were somehow serving socialism by serving the Soviet state. Shachtman analyzed with great psychological insight the thought processes of such men under the secret police's treatment, strict isolation, extremes of heat and cold, inadequate food and clothing, nothing to read, nothing to do, all of which could be ended simply by agreeing to perform one more service for the USSR. He did not call the defendants cowards, but he said that they had been fatally misguided in believing their jailers' promises of clemency, and fatally misguided in imagining that there could be any compromise between socialism and Stalinism. Despite their weakness and isolation, Trotsky and his followers tried to broadcast the truth about the trials. Trotsky was still capable of a, quote, utterly staggering, end quote, amount of work. Shachtman remembered, but he was under tremendous strain, shocked by his old comrades' degrading confessions and, quote, cooped up, end quote, by the Norwegian government. Soon, the Norwegian government interned Trotsky, destroying Trotsky's ability to respond to the charges against him. The Norwegian government assigned an official known to be a fascist to censor his ingoing and outgoing mail. At the end of 1936, the Norwegian government expelled Trotsky from Norwegian soil. Shachtman got Trotsky a Mexican visa and was delighted when Trotsky accepted. Shachtman drove down from New York to Mexico with fellow Trotskyist George Novak, so that when Trotsky's boat arrived in Tampico in January 1937, Shachtman was there to meet him at the dock. Trotsky and Shachtman took a train from Tampico to Mexico City, where Trotsky moved in with radical artists Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. The move untied Trotsky's hands for his defense against Stalin's accusations. In April 1937, Glotzer went down to Mexico to record a Trotskyist-organized commission of inquiry, chaired by philosopher John Dewey, which declared the Moscow trial a frame-up. Shachtman threw himself into the task of exposing the trials, which was tailor-made for him. Shachtman drew on his skills as a publicist by making a new effort to make Trotsky's writings known to the public, preparing a new edition of Trotsky's selected works. Trotsky praised Shachtman's, quote, extraordinarily good edition, end quote, with, quote, your so weighty and informative introduction, end quote. Shachtman's gifts of invective and irony could be given full rein in his own speeches and articles about the trials. After his return from Mexico, Shachtman set off on a speaking tour from New York to Hollywood, and back again and again, exposing the same lies, denouncing the killings. One of Shachtman's speeches against the trials was a godsend to Trotskyists at City College. The 3 lone Trotskyist students there at the beginning of 1936 shared, quote, murky, end quote, alcove 1 in the vast, quote, slummy and smelly, end quote, college cafeteria with various socialist and old guard social democrats. Occasionally, young Trotskyists would climb onto a cafeteria table and start speaking in an effort to gather a crowd. But all the denizens of Alcove 1 put together had perhaps a fifth of the drawing power of the communists in Alcove 2, until Shachtman came to City College to debate. Irving Howe, a storekeeper's son noted for his own skill at cafeteria oratory, remembered years later how Shachtman turned his communist opponent's comparison of Trotsky with Benedict Arnold inside out, pointing out that if Arnold's plot had succeeded, he would have put Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Franklin on trial as traitors, just as Stalin had tried and executed all the other leaders of the Russian Revolution. The debate broke the City College communist, quote, impenetrable armor, end quote. Shachtman saw that the executions were bound to continue in the Soviet Union for years unless international pressure put a stop to them. Quote, the conscience of the labor and revolutionary movements will be stoned if it did not reply to this summons, end quote, he said. But his plea for the international working class movement to, quote, ring out in such a mighty protest, end quote, that the trials would went mostly unheeded. Quote, only a few thousand who escaped the influence of Stalinism responded, end quote. He said later, quote, the others were indifferent or clearly antagonistic, end quote. The trials continued. The deaths continued. Shachtman was bitter, particularly at the spectacle of writers, safe, respected, and prosperous in the United States, who thought that they could prove their radicalism by apologizing for Stalin. These writers carried out, quote, the dirtiest hackwork, the most shameful and sophisticated apologetics, end quote, for Stalin. He later remembered. Shachtman was also afraid of more attacks to come. Quote, Stalin is to, quote, get, end quote, Trotsky, he said. Quote, Stalin is out to, quote, get, end quote, Trotsky, Shachtman said, quote, and Stalin will not rest until he does, end quote. Anyone who claimed the heritage of the Russian Revolution now had to choose between Stalin and the communists he was killing. Those who chose Stalin, openly or through their silence, were separated from his victims and their supporters by a sea of blood. Communists escalated their attacks on Trotskyists to new heights of vilification. In the 1920s, Trotskyists were dismissed as disguised social democrats. By the early 1930s, they were denounced as objective allies of fascism. By the late 1930s, the rulers in the Kremlin and their U.S. followers made grotesque accusations. Trotskyists were and always had been a ring of conspirators in Hitler's pay, spies, saboteurs, poisoners, assassins. Trotskyists were often embattled even in their own families, since young Trotskyists like Hal Draper and Gordon Haskell had communist brothers. Just as Shachtman's commitment to Trotskyism had been reinforced by communist leaders' lies about it in the early 1930s, border lies fed his revulsion from Stalinism. Quote, falsehood is the weapon of reaction and truth the weapon of socialism, end quote, Shachtman said. But there were not many who acknowledged the truth. Trotskyists became more willing to question their loyalty to the Soviet Union and their conviction that it was a worker state. Their sense of loyalty was strong. They had seen themselves as the real champions of the Red Army and Soviet state, while Stalin was subverting and endangering them. Jim Cannon had told his communist inquisitors in 1928, quote, Trotsky will be fighting for the Soviet Union when many of those who are hollering against him will be on the other side of the barricades, end quote. Facing the prospect of a war in which the Soviet Union would be allied with U.S., British, and French empires, Trotskyists had reaffirmed in 1934 that they would do everything possible to rush aid to the Soviet Union for its defense, even as they opposed Western countries' war efforts. But now they could not avoid the question, why support a state that was betraying socialism internationally and at home? Some Trotskyists began to say the Counter-Revolution had overthrown the Soviet worker state. Joe Carter was the first to challenge Trotsky's position that a worker state still existed, followed by James Burnham and Manny Geltman. The Soviet bureaucracy was in fact destroying the nationalized economy, Carter said, recreating private property and consolidating itself as a new propertied class. Quote, the class rule of the proletariat, however, carried out. Through full Soviet democracy, the Revolutionary Party, several workers' parties, or through a distorting but still proletarian bureaucracy is an essential aspect of a workers' state, end quote, he argued. Since workers were no longer ruling the Soviet Union in any sense, it was no longer a workers' state. I mean, I'll read on, obviously. I'm reading the whole book, but this seems like a to my understanding of Carter, this is a misrepresentation of Carter's views. I don't think he had the idea that the Soviet bureaucracy was recreating private property. That seems a misrepresentation. Shachtman disagreed with Carter and delivered the majority report at the Trotskyist 1938 convention against him. Geltman remembered that in 1938, Shachtman and he, quote, were thrown out of a cafe in Paris because we were arguing so loudly, end quote. But Shachtman could hardly consider Trotsky's 1936 position as sacrosanct, when Trotsky himself was modifying it in subtle ways. In the summer of 1938, Trotsky called for the expulsion of all bureaucrats from democratized Soviets. In the spring of 1939, when Hungary seized the Ukrainian-speaking part of Czechoslovakia, Trotsky began calling for an independent Soviet Ukraine. Trotsky reasoned that calling on Ukrainians outside the USSR to rebel and unite with the Soviet Ukraine was useless because Ukrainians would not throw off Hungarian or Polish oppression in order to submit to Stalin's oppression. Calling for a, quote, united, free, and independent workers and peasants Soviet Ukraine, end quote, on the other hand, could spark not only Ukrainian rebellions against Hungary and Poland, but revolution in Soviet Ukraine, which might lead to the overthrow of the bureaucracy throughout the Soviet Union. Shachtman accepted Trotsky's innovations, but began to have doubts about the position Trotsky was leaving unchanged. When Carter and Burnham proposed in September 1938, at the founding Congress of the Fourth International, tabled Trotsky's innovative paragraph on the Soviets pending fuller discussion. Shachtman and Cannon agreed that more discussion was needed. Lenin said that even capitalists should not necessarily be excluded from Soviets. Shachtman pointed out at the Congress, could there be no exceptions for bureaucrats? The discussion showed the confusion and dissension in the Trotskyist ranks. Each of the delegates who spoke up to defend Trotsky's idea had a different argument. One said that bureaucrats had to be expelled from the Soviets because bureaucrats were a class. Another said the bureaucrats had to be expelled because the bureaucrats were not a class. A couple claimed that the point was minor, and another said that Trotskyists should call for excluding bureaucrats, but not necessarily do it. Quote, the great variety of views expressed, end quote, Shachtman summed up, quote, showed clear that a further discussion and clarification was necessary, end quote. He began to rethink his position. In November 1938, he pointedly avoided open agreement with either Carter or Trotsky. In December, he proposed to open a free discussion on the issue throughout the Socialist Workers Party. He rejected Carter's idea that the bureaucracy was restoring private property in the Soviet Union, a notion he would never find plausible. Carter's idea that workers' political power was an essential characteristic of a workers' state, however, was one that he found interesting. He was beginning to combine Trotsky's ideas and Carter's into a distinct position of his own. Yeah, I think, this, to my understanding of Shachtman and the bureaucratic collectivism thesis, is that Shachtman, in the period when there was eventually culminates in the split between the Socialist Workers Party and the Workers Party, when the minority of the Socialist Workers Party is expelled from the party, that Shachtman, that the definition of the USSR was not the primary cause. In fact, the minority had the three different positions. I think it was Abern. I might be talking on my ass, but believe it was Abern that still held on to the degenerated workers' state theory. Shachtman had doubts, and Carter rejected the degenerated workers' state theory. What they were fundamentally, the fundamental political disagreements, the basis of the split, which neither party seemed to want, at least not the Workers' Party and not Trotsky, but I think you could say that the Cannonites definitely wanted the minority out, was a disagreement on how to relate to Soviet expansionism. And those were like the key cornerstones of the debates. And obviously the nature of Soviet expansionism is not a totally separate question from what the Soviet society was or is. But that was the more like concrete political question, as opposed to the theoretical questions that were causing divisions in the Socialist Workers' Party. Trotsky and the Workers' Party did not seek to split. They did not view the theoretical differences on the nature of the Soviet Union as a necessary condition for a split. I can't remember the story, but it was basically like what the at one of the congresses of the Socialist Workers' Party, there was some proposal put forward that was to be voted on that would basically silence the minority, and the minority refused to sign it, or something like that, and that was viewed as grounds for expulsion. They wouldn't submit to their own silencing. It's basically the way I understand it, but I'll have to review the literature. Maybe this book will tell us something about that as well. Where am I? The mutating Soviet state shaped the communist movement in the 1930s to fit its requirements. The initial impetus behind Communist Popular Front policy came from Stalin's desire for an alliance with Britain and France against Germany. U.S. communists therefore backed not only Roosevelt's domestic reforms, but Roosevelt's pro-British, pro-French foreign policy. Breaking with the communist perspective of the 1920s, they identified the United States as a Pacific power standing up to warmongers. Trotskyists disagreed. Trotskyists continued to see the United States as an imperial power that needed room to expand and would cause war to get it. Quote, American imperialism cannot expand further or even maintain its existing world position without cutting deeply into the share of world power now in the hands of other imperialist nations, end quote, the Trotskyists said. Quote, the economy and politics of the United States depends upon crises, wars, and revolutions in all parts of the world, end quote. Shachtman pointed to the soaring military budget Roosevelt had gotten from Congress, over $1 billion by 1936. Shachtman called Roosevelt, quote, the agent of American imperialism in its gigantic war preparations, end quote. The whole idea of distinguishing between, quote, peace-loving, end quote, aggressive, end quote, capitalist governments was fraudulent for Shachtman. They were all aggressive, quote, just as lions are by their very nature carnivorous and diplomatists are by their very nature liars, end quote. The United States, Britain, and France had already had their empires and were clinging to the status quo. Quote, Hitler has to match the American record in Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba, Mexico, end quote, Shachtman said. Quote, the record of imperialist France in northern Africa and in Asia is far more atrocious than anything done to date by Hitler and Mussolini, end quote. Neither the United States nor Britain nor France had slowed the pace of the arms race or the momentum toward war. The most important test of communist international policy came in Spain. Spain had been in turmoil since 1931 when the dictator Primo de Rivera had been overthrown and a republic established. Early in 1936, elections installed a Popular Front government uniting liberal Republicans, socialists, and communists. Rightist generals, including Francisco Franco, backed by fascist Germany and Italy, reacted in July by trying to overthrow the Republic. The coup attempt plunged the country into civil war. The Republic survived only in the Madrid region, the Basque Country to the north, and Catalonia to the east. The general's coup was temporarily thwarted, not by the government, but by working-class organizations, above all anarchists and the independent communists of the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, POUM, The anarchists in POUM, especially strong and independent-minded Catalonia and its industrial capital, Barcelona, founded their own people's militias that bore the brunt of the fighting in the Civil War. Landlords' estates were seized, factories occupied. The situation resembled the, quote, dual power, end quote, that existed in Russia before November 1917, with the government and workers' organizations neither completely in control, jockeying for power. The government was under pressure to restore order and reassure the country's capitalists and landowners, they overwhelmingly supported Franco, Pressure came from, above all, from the Soviet Union, which saw the Spanish War as its chance to get democratic Britain and France to ally against Germany. At first, Stalin went along with the British-French farce of agreeing with Germany and Italy not to intervene and overlooking blatant German and Italian aid to Franco. No Soviet aid arrived in the summer of 1936, except some food and bandages, which Shachtman called, quote, alms given with a sneer, end quote. Stalin did eventually opt out of the farce of non-intervention and provided the Republican side with precious weapons, duly paid for with Spanish gold, In return, Stalin urged the Republican government to ensure as quickly and dramatically as possible that there would be no Spanish Socialist Revolution to frighten Britain and France out of cooperation with the USSR. In May 1937, the Republican government made its move, seizing the anarchist-occupied Barcelona telephone exchange. After some fighting, the anarchists and POUM, who wanted to avoid confrontation with while the Civil War was on, agreed to withdraw. The government responded in June by sending in its army and jailing and slaughtering the disarmed anarchist and POUM members. Trotskyists had been critical of the anarchists and POUM before 1937. POUM leaders Andrew Nin and Juan Andrade were former Trotskyists who rejected Trotsky's urging to go into the Spanish Socialist Party, shocked Trotsky by signing the Popular Front program, and expelled the remaining loyal Trotskyists in their ranks. Trotsky believed that anarchists and POUM had ruined Spain's chances for a socialist revolution by failing to take power in Barcelona when they had the chance. I don't know how entering the Socialist Party would have caused them to take power, helped them take power, but Trotskyists everywhere are united in condemning the repressive actions of the Spanish Republican government, backed by the Spanish Communist and Socialist parties. Shachtman declared that the Barcelona events revealed the Communist International as, quote, the fiercest protagonist within the labor movement of the monstrous fraud known as bourgeois democracy, and the most brutal, aggressive guardian, of capitalist private property, end quote. If anything could deepen the divide between Trotskyists and Communists after the Moscow trials began, the Barcelona events did it. The Spanish Republic soldiers and leaders were Communists' most beloved heroes in the late 1930s. Many U.S. Communists and sympathizers joined the Lincoln Brigade that fought alongside the Republican Army. Many died in the sincere belief that they were fighting for democracy. Yet even in the Lincoln Brigade, there were people who took part in attacks on the anti-Stalinist left. Communists and liberals who supported the Republic did not want to know. They were eager to believe that anyone repeating such stories was a fascist. The Spanish War even divided Trotskyists from other socialists, in particular from socialist leader Norman Thomas. Thomas, a clean-cut son of an Ohio Presbyterian minister, had been a religious pacifist and Woodrow Wilson supporter before becoming the socialist presidential standard-bearer in 1928. Norman Thomas was obviously no Marxist. Trotskyists believed that Norman Thomas calling himself a socialist was a result of some kind of misunderstanding. As early as 1924, when Thomas ran for governor of New York, Shachtman poked fun at him in the Daily Worker. Quote, every evening before he dons his nightie, he lights a lamp and says a prayer for clean government in hopes that the workers will forget that there is or should be or might be such a thing as class struggle, end quote. Even as Thomas's ally decades later, Shachtman spoke of his timidity. Thomas, quote, thinks 10 times before he steps on anyone's toes, end quote. Thomas had drifted leftward with the tide in the early 1930s, but by 1937, Thomas was drifting back. Thomas visited Spain in 1937 and met with Francisco Largo Caballero, leader of the Spanish Socialist left wing, who had been prime minister in the government that suppressed the May 1937 Barcelona uprising. Largo Caballero had not ordered the repression. Largo Caballero had resigned as prime minister less than 2 weeks after the fighting broke out. But neither had he supported the uprising. Norman Thomas came back defending Largo Caballero. The appeal group could not stand for this equivocation. The Spanish Revolution in 1936-37 was the best argument for revolutionary Marxism since 1917. It was an opportunity to explain revolutionary politics that they could not pass up. They fought hard to have socialists repudiate Thomas and condemn the Spanish Popular Front, which they blamed for the Barcelona killings. It was a hard debate. Young recruit Leo Seidlitz later commented that he did not feel isolated on any other issue, not on opposing Roosevelt, not on opposing LaGuardia, but, quote, Spain, that was isolating, that we were a freak minority on, end quote. To even Shachtman and Cannon's initial disquiet, Trotsky insisted that his followers oppose any aid to the Republican government, which was, after all, killing socialists, and instead support aid to the left-wing militias. Understanding this position required a high level of political sophistication. Appeal supporters acquired this sophistication, joining Appeal meant enrolling in a course of, quote, hothouse learning, end quote, and were soon vigorously condemning other socialist confusion. But other socialists proved stubborn. The line between Appeal and the rest hardened. Footnote. The debate over Spain underlined A.J. Musk's break with the Trotskyists. Having fought an alliance with Abern and Glotzer against going into the Socialist Party, he had joined it once the Trotskyists voted to him. But unlike Abern and Glotzer, Musk had not stayed within the Appeal group. The Spanish War pushed him still further from Trotskyism. The prospect of a world war made him revert to his early religious pacifism. End footnote. Spain became, quote, the touchstone issue, end quote. Shachtman and Cannon predicted that the Socialist Party would be a far easier organization to recruit from than the Communist Party. But they had also warned that once revolutionaries gained strength within it, Thomas's vaunted commitment to a, quote, all-inclusive party, end quote, would crumble. Years before going into the Socialist Party, Shachtman had called the militants around Thomas, quote, a lightning rod for grounding truly revolutionary sentiment in the party into the safe soil of reformism, end quote. In normal times, they were, quote, quite quiet office boys of the right-wing bureaucracy, end quote, he said. In times of crisis, they were, quote, the emergency brake on the advance of the workers, end quote. In March 1937, Thomas had persuaded an emergency party convention to ban the Socialist Appeal as a, quote, factional organ, end quote. Although Shachtman and Cannon had convinced Trotskyists to abide by the resolution, the debate over Barcelona aggravated the tensions. Trotsky believed that only the lack of a revolutionary Marxist party in Spain and Catalonia had prevented a socialist revolution. Victory there would have given Trotskyists the same overwhelming impetus around the world that communists had received from the Russian Revolution. Now the chance was lost. The defeat was bitter. But Trotsky believed that new revolutionary opportunities would arise in other countries, and Trotsky was determined that the next one would not be missed. The experience with POUM had shown the futility of waiting for forces vacillating between reformism and revolutionary politics to make up their minds, he said. Revolutionary parties should be set up in every country as soon as possible. In April 1937, Trotsky told Al Glotzer in Mexico the U.S. Trotskyists should leave the Socialist Party. In late May, Trotsky gave Cannon and Shachtman the same advice. Quote, we suddenly found ourselves under irresistible pressure, and that pressure came from Trotsky himself, end quote, Shachtman remembered. Trotskyist position in the Socialist Party became still more precarious when a debate broke out over the 1937 New York mayoral election. Thomas had been the socialist candidate against Fiorello LaGuardia, the incumbent liberal Republican who had pro-Roosevelt Union leaders solidly behind him. Encouraged by the militants, Thomas withdrew from the race in favor of LaGuardia. Trotskyists criticized Thomas harshly. Shachtman, who had argued at first that Trotsky was pushing for too early a split, sent out a joint statement with Cannon at the end of June calling a, quote, speedy split, end quote, inevitable. Fed up with criticism, New York socialist leaders expelled over 50 Trotskyists at one stroke in August 1937. The Socialist National Executive Committee condemned the New York expulsions, then legalized them retroactively because the expelled Trotskyists had begun publishing the appeal again. A steady wave of expulsions flowed through the party over the following weeks. Quote, we welcome the expulsions, end quote. Shachtman remembered, quote, we were enormously enthusiastic, end quote. The Trotskyists walked away with the majority of socialists in New York, California, Chicago, Ohio, and Minnesota. The Socialist Party continued on a downward rightward spiral. From 17,000 members at the end of 1935 and 11,000 in mid-1936, it fell to about 6,000 members at the end of 1937, barely 3,000 in mid-1938, and under 2,000 by the end of 1940. Trotskyists emerged from the split with over 1,000 members. In addition, the Young People's Socialist League broke its ties to the Socialist Party and took the name Young People's Socialist League, parenthesis, Fourth International, end parenthesis. adding hundreds more to the ranks of U.S. Fourth Internationalists. Still dwarfed by the Communists, the Trotskyists were now at least comparable in strength to the couple of thousand ineffectual socialists. In January 1938, they founded the Socialist Workers Party. Its foundation was a prelude to the official proclamation of the Fourth International. Shachtman's highest recognition in the Trotskyist movement came on the 3rd of September 1938. On that day, Shachtman presided in the village of Perigny, outside of Paris, over the founding Congress of the Fourth International, an attempt to prepare the world's Trotskyists for daunting tasks ahead. Trotsky had said since 1933 that another world war was inevitable unless socialist revolutions averted the danger. After the Barcelona events of 1937, war rather than revolution was the immediate prospect. Trotsky counted on the Congress to solidify and invigorate his following so that it could hold together and make a breakthrough during the war, which he thought would make or break Trotskyism. By September 1938, the most dynamic political force in the world, to all outward appearances, was fascism. Hitler had crushed the German Social Democratic and Communist parties, the central bulwarks of the European labor movement. Hitler treated with contempt every rule that governed the European order between the wars, the peace treaties, the disarmament requirements, the requirements for German reparations, the League of Nations, the intricate structure of loans and deals, and the rules faded as if they had never been more than diplomats' daydreams. In 1936, the German army, barely constituted, occupied the previously demilitarized Rhineland. In March 1938, it occupied Austria. As the Fourth International's Congress met, the Germans were preparing to march into Czechoslovakia and attack on a French ally that the British and French governments would meet with ignominious surrender. People's faith in the capitalist world order had already been shaken by the First World War. To the extent faith survived in the 1920s, it rested largely on the illusion that Wilsonian liberalism, benevolent preparation of colonies for independence, free trade, the League of Nations, would reform the world order and guarantee peace. But free trade was destroyed by the Depression, movements for national independence in India and Nicaragua were suppressed, and the League of Nations was a joke once it had failed to stop Italy's conquest of Ethiopia. Liberal illusions were propped up in the late 1930s by those unlikely crutches, the Communist International and the Soviet Union. Communists preached, quote, collective security, end quote, as the salvation of democracy. As war impended over Czechoslovakia, Stalin vowed to defend it against Germany. As war impended over Czechoslovakia, Stalin vowed to defend it against Germany if France would. Trotskyists were set apart from Stalinists by the rejection of all illusions about the status quo and peace. Trotskyists were fervently anti-fascist. In February 1939, Trotskyists would organize a protest by tens of thousands of people against a Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden, with Shachtman and other leaders speaking eloquently and standing firm at the head of the march as police attacked it. With their rally front-page news and their leaflet reproduced by millions in the daily papers, Trotsky's anti-fascist credentials were secure. But Shachtman attacked communist defense of Czechoslovakia, a country which he called a, quote, synthetic product of an abominable peace treaty, end quote, a, quote, pawn of French imperialism, end quote, that oppressed Slavics, Germans, Hungarians, and Ukrainians. Shachtman ridiculed communists in Dublin, who before Munich, quote, ran up and down the city calling upon good Irishmen and true to rally to the defense, who, quote, ran up and down the city calling upon all good Irishmen and true to rally to the defense of that institution so deeply beloved by Abern, British democracy, end quote. Like Trotsky, Shachtman expected that once war began, discontent with it would grow rapidly and the Trotskyist movement would come. Given the weakness of the scattered Trotskyist groups, unity behind a clear program would be crucial to their survival and ability to seize new opportunities. Although Trotsky had originally meant the Fourth International to be founded with larger forces than his own small following, the Popular Front's appeal had pulled European socialists away from Trotsky's movement. Even some of the Trotskyist groups had deserted him. The unifications and splits of the mid-1930s seemed to many to lead, quote, to nothing more positive than the constant churning up of stagnant water, end quote. Shachtman said, although Congress organizers talked about Trotskyist groups in 31 countries, when the Congress assembled, it claimed to represent only 11. The Socialist Workers Party, the largest of them, had about 1,000 members, well below the 2,000 or 3,000 Trotsky had originally set as a minimum. The Belgian, French, and Polish groups had several hundred each. Most of the Germans were in jails or concentration camps. The rest counted their members in handfuls. Trotsky counted on Shachtman to help make the Congress a success and end the movement's retreat. Shachtman's, quote, work, not only during but after the conference, will be of the greatest value, end quote, he said. The few dozen delegates, including 3 from the United States, Shachtman, Cannon, and Nathan Gould, gathered in secrecy in a little village on the outskirts of Paris. They met in pleasant surroundings, a converted barn belonging to an old French radical leader, in the middle of a beautiful garden. I believe that was Alfred Rosemer's home, even though he was like, I think it was Alfred Rosemer, that's his name. He was a Trotskyist, but I think he like stepped away from Trotskyism. But he still was in good enough contact with the Trotskyist movement to lend him their home as a place to meet. It wasn't just a radical, it was like a very important radical. But maybe my information is wrong. But the mood, as the young Greek delegate, Michel Raptis, remembered it, was somber. The delegates were weighed down by a sense of their responsibility. Even Cannon, whom Raptis thought of as jovial and outgoing, seemed subdued. The delegates were afraid to let anyone else know about their meeting place for fear of giving Stalin's agents a chance to attack. They met for only a single day, beginning at 9:30 in the morning and continuing until late at night, all of them sitting around one long table. The delegates spent much of the day discussing how to prepare for the war, expose the war plans of the United States and its allies to be, along with Hitler's, and move towards a transformed post-war world. Shachtman's biggest contribution was a, quote, thesis on the world role of American imperialism, end quote. Much of it restated that what Trotskyists had been saying since their anti-war manifesto of 1934. It repeated the verdict that the United States was, quote, the principal motive force in propelling the capitalist world towards another war and the firmest brake upon the revolutionary movement, end quote. But Shachtman's resolution went beyond orthodoxy to prophecy, foreseeing a post-war world ruled from Washington and New York. It went beyond mere prediction, too, to plot a joint fight after the war by U.S., Latin American, and Asian rebels against the new empire. In Europe, the resolution said the only capitalist alternative to post-war German domination was post-war U.S. domination. Trotsky had warned as early as 1926 that the United States was consolidating its hold over Europe, though both communist and anti-communist opponents ridiculed the idea. The resolution accepted Trotsky's analysis that U.S. isolationism of the 1920s and 1930s was only a facade, and U.S. passivity in Europe had only been a measure of its supremacy there. The resolution said that U.S. rulers were now about to drop their isolationist mask, which belonged to, quote, an epoch of the past, end quote. Quote, it is out of the question for the United States to remain a passive observer of the coming war. Quite the contrary. Not only will it participate actively as one of the belligerents, but it is easy to predict that it will enter the war after a much shorter interval than elapsed before its entry into the last World War, ... The United States will dictate the terms of the imperialist peace after emerging as the victor. The United States' participation will not only determine the victory of the side it joins, but will also determine the disposition of the booty of which it will claim the lion's share, end quote. The U.S. called for a, quote, open door, end quote, in China and East Asia. The U.S. call for a, quote, open door, end quote, in China and East Asia was as deceitful as its isolationism in Europe. Both stances cloaked U.S. designs for mastery, which Japan blocked in the Pacific as Germany did in the Atlantic. Quote, behind this, quote, Pacific, end quote, slogan is the half-drawn sword against both Japan and England for an increasing right to exploit China, end quote. U.S. war preparations were already visible in reinforcements of its Aleutian and Guam bases, and Roosevelt's demand for the highest peacetime naval budget ever. Already these war preparations were helping the United States supplant Britain and Canada and Australia which turned to the United States for protection against Japan. U.S. socialists had to respond by demanding U.S. withdrawal from the Pacific and independence of U.S. colonies there, Hawaii, Samoa, and the Philippines. The U.S. government's democratic and peaceful masquerade was nowhere so obviously fraudulent as in Latin America. Roosevelt had devised a new form of sugarcoating his, quote, good neighbor, end quote, policy, which meant that only that, quote, the policy of the iron fist in Latin America is sheathed in the velvet glove of demagogic pretensions of friendship and, quote, democracy, end quote, end quote. Roosevelt's real policy was revealed by his loyalty to Anastasio Somoza, quote, our son of a bitch, end quote, in Nicaragua. Quote, the Monroe Doctrine has been uniformly interpreted by all the Washington administrators as the right of American imperialism to the dominant position in the Latin American countries, preliminary to the conquest of the position as their exclusive exploiter. In the Central American, Caribbean, and Upper South American countries in particular, this has signified, the position, often by the most naked use of force of governments which are the merest puppets in the hands of Wall Street, The real character of, quote, democratic, end quote, American capitalism is best revealed by, the bloodthirsty despots under whose oppressive rule the millions of workers and peasants of Latin America suffer, end quote. Shachtman's interest in linking Latin American and North American struggles dated back to the mid-1920s. Shachtman had been acting secretary of the communist-backed All-American Anti-Imperialist League, which had published a Spanish-language monthly called El Libertador in Mexico, and Libertador in Mexico, and claimed to have sections in 11 countries. In 1933, Shachtman had said, quote, for the masses in Latin America, the struggle for liberation from Yankee oppression is bound up by 1,000 invisible threads with the movement of the American working class, end quote. Although Shachtman's call for a, quote, union of the Latin American peoples, end quote, recalled Trotskyist 1934 slogan of a, quote, Soviet United States of South and Central America, end quote, he now pushed Trotskyist towards a more pan-American strategy. His resolution declared that U.S. revolutionaries were bound to Latin American rebels by more than ordinary ties of international solidarity. The Socialist Workers Party should organize protest against U.S. intervention in Latin America, try to keep U.S. troops north of the Rio Grande, and demand independence for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and a provision of, quote, borderlands, and, quote, battles, refugee organizing, and resistance to the U.S.-Mexico Free Trade Pact decades later. The resolution said that U.S. radicals had to organize Mexican, Caribbean, and Latin American working people within the United States, to link them not only with U.S. unions, but also with, quote, revolutionary movements in the countries from which these workers originally came, end quote. Latin America and U.S. revolutionary struggles would join to create, quote, the United Socialist Republics of the Americas, end quote. Shachtman summed up the case against supporting the Allies in an anti-war manifesto Shachtman drafted for the Congress. Fascism and war were simply the, quote, poisons, end quote, emitted by, quote, mortally wounded, end quote, capitalism, the manifesto said. Shachtman scoffed at communists and the social democrats who swore that the war would be fought not, quote, for spheres of influence, sources of raw materials, colonies, and markets, end quote, but for, quote, the great and honorable cause of smashing fascism, The garbage which these social democratic war missionaries spread before the workers is not new. It is the same foul stuff with which they poisoned the European masses 25 years ago, end quote, Shachtman said. Quote, the mothers of the people are called upon to become brood sows, Fields will be transformed into blood-soaked trenches and cities into devastated tombs, so that the imperialists may preserve their profits and their colonies or acquire new ones, end quote. Only the Fourth International, the manifesto concluded, offered a way out. Trotskyists did not delude themselves that Trotskyists had anything like the strength necessary to save the world. Polish Trotskyists in particular pointed out the movement's weakness. Before and during the Congress, the Poles made a strong case against proclaiming an international on this feeble basis. Isaac Deutscher was present. I believe Isaac Deutscher, who was, the main the most famous biographer of Leon Trotsky, famous historian in general. I believe he was at this meeting representing Poland at this time, and was against the formation of the Fourth International, I'm pretty sure. Where am I? Polish Trotskyists in particular pointed out the movement's weakness. Before, during, and during the Congress, the Poles made a strong case against proclaiming an international on this feeble basis. The Poles pointed out that each of the previous internationals, parenthesis, the first, founded in 1864, the second, founded in 1889, and the third, founded in 1919, had thousands of working-class people in several countries behind it at its foundation. Each, by the act of its foundation, was staking a plausible claim to international leadership. The Trotskyist claim had no such plausibility. In these circumstances, the Poles saw proclaiming the Fourth International as, quote, a gesture, a folly, end quote. Excuse me. Trotsky insisted that his followers had to push forward alone. Quote, this international will become strong by our own action, not by maneuvers with other groups, end quote, he said. Quote, we have no reason to boast that we are strong, but we are what we are, end quote. Shachtman supported Trotsky before and during the Congress, but unlike the Brazilian Mario Pedrosa and other delegates who attacked the Poles with bluster and called them, quote, Mensheviks, end quote, Shachtman looked carefully at their historical analogies before concluding that they were wrong. Lenin had not waited for the Russian Revolution before calling for a new international. He pointed out, nor for communist parties to be built outside Russia before proclaiming it. He declared the need for it in 1914, when the need became clear. Then Lenin delayed proclaiming it for 5 years, quote, because he hoped to win over various vacillating and centrist groups, end quote, just as Trotsky delayed from 1933 to 1938. There was no reason to delay any longer, quote, all the centrist organizations have either disintegrated or evolved away from us, end quote, Shachtman said, quote, the path is thus clear for the proclamation of the Fourth and is necessary to constitute it definitively, end quote. The Poles' defeat in the final vote was a foregone conclusion, but Shachtman went out of his way to stand up for the Poles later in the session. Stalin just decreed the dissolution of the Polish Communist Party on the fantastic pretext that it was controlled by Trotskyists and Gestapo agents. Trotsky proposed the Polish Trotskyists proclaim a new Polish Communist Party. Against the Poles resisted. To proclaim a party with their 350 people would be a, quote, useless and dangerous ... fiction, end quote, they said. Emboldened by the earlier victories over the Poles, several delegates condemned them for their lack of revolutionary zeal and said that they should be ordered to found a party. But Shachtman shrank from imposing policy on a national group. Shachtman said that the Polish group should, quote, concentrate from the present moment 90% of its energy towards the creation of a new communist party, end quote, but should not, quote, rush into proclaiming the new party without the necessary preparation, end quote. Shachtman's face-saving compromise passed. Several times at the Congress, a proposal by Shachtman ended a discussion. One theme reiterated again and again in the minutes shows how great his authority in the International had grown. Delegates said unanimously and repeatedly that Shachtman had to stay in Europe as a permanent member of the International Secretariat. The French delegates said that unless Shachtman came to Paris, they would insist that the International Center be moved to New York. The Congress as a whole voted unanimously that Shachtman should stay in Europe. Many of the delegates must have wondered afterwards if Shachtman's life or the International's would have been different if Shachtman had obeyed the summons. None of them could have guessed that when the International held its next conference, Shachtman would not even be allowed to attend. Shachtman did not move to Paris. Instead, several of the International's leaders moved to New York. One of them was C.L.R. James, a black Trotskyist intellectual from Trinidad who was 3 years older than Shachtman and already well known as a novelist, historian, Pan-African leader, and cricket writer. C.L.R. James left London and became one of Shachtman's collaborators on The New International. James began assembling a devoted personal following among U.S. Trotskyists who were drawn by his passionate speeches, tall muscular handsomeness, and charisma. For some of them, James was, quote, a figure of physical grace and the veritable symbol of revolutionary promise, end quote. For the Trotskyist movement as a whole, James was one of a handful of leaders who gave the Fourth International intellectual distinction. A man who wrote confidently about a wide range of subjects including Plato, Lenin, Africa, Herman Melville, cricket, and the comics. The foundation of the Fourth International was a defiant gesture in the face of overwhelming odds. By the normal ground rules of political life in 1938, the proclamation of this tiny movement seemed senseless. But it made sense in Trotsky's mind and his followers' minds, because they saw that normal ground rules were about to be suspended by a world war. In those last months before the war broke out, thinking people saw it opening up in front of them like an abyss. Trotskyists believed that they were laying the foundations for the bridge that would allow humanity to get across the abyss. That's the end of Chapter 3 of Peter Drucker's Max Shachtman and His Left. Thank you so much for listening.